The sun in the Helmand province doesn't just shine, it punishes. It's a heavy, visceral heat that settles over everything like a wet wool blanket, drawing the moisture out of your pores until your skin feels like parchment. For the men and women of Alpha Company, the dust was a permanent resident in their lungs, a fine, talcum-like powder that tasted of ancient earth and spent diesel. On this particular morning, the sky was a bruised shade of violet, bleeding into a pale, sickly yellow as the sun began its ascent over the jagged ridgelines. It was the kind of morning that felt heavy with a silence that shouldn't have been there. Staff Sergeant Ward Briggs sat in the lead MRAP, his eyes shielded by dark ballistic lenses, scanning the horizon with the practiced, predatory patience of a man who had spent most of his adult life looking through a high-powered optic. Briggs was a legend in the unit, a man who seemed more machine than human when he was behind his rifle. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was usually to correct a calculation or confirm a kill. Beside him, his spotter, Corporal Haynes, was adjusting the radio frequency, his movements jittery compared to Briggs's stasis. They were the shield of the convoy, the guardian angels on the high ground, and as long as Briggs was watching, the rest of the soldiers felt a thin, precarious sense of security. Further back in the third truck, wedged between crates of 56 ammunition and spare batteries, sat Corporal Reese Callahan. If Briggs was the sun around which the company orbited, Reese was a ghost. She had spent the last 6 months perfecting the art of being part of the furniture. As an ammo carrier and support specialist, her job was to be the logistics backbone, the person who ensured the shooters had what they needed to keep shooting. She was small, compact, and quiet, so quiet that most of the guys forgot she was even in the room. She preferred it that way. In a world of bravado and chest thumping, invisibility was a luxury. It meant no one asked about her past, no one looked too closely at the way she handled a weapon during maintenance, and no one wondered why a girl with her reflexes was content carrying heavy crates instead of pulling a trigger. The hum of the MRAP's engine was a low, vibrating growl that made conversation difficult, but that never stopped Private Kowalski. Kowalski was 20 years old, filled with the kind of nervous energy that demanded an audience, and unfortunately for Reese, she was his captive one. He spent most of the ride leaning against the interior hull, his eyes darting toward the Barrett M82, the light 50, strapped to the roof rack above them. To most, it was a weapon of war. To Kowalski, it was a holy relic. He kept asking if she'd ever felt the kick of it, if she'd ever seen what a 50 caliber round does to a concrete wall at 1,000 yards. Reese would just nod or offer a one-word answer, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. She knew exactly what that rifle could do. She knew the weight of the bolt, the crystalline clarity of the Schmidt and Bender scope, and the way the world seemed to stop moving the moment your finger found the take-up on the trigger. But she didn't say that. She just watched the mountains. The convoy slowed as they entered a narrow valley where the road constricted between a steep ridgeline and a cluster of mud brick dwellings. The village looked like it had been carved out of the mountain itself, a series of low-slung huts that seemed abandoned yet felt inhabited. There were no children playing, no goats wandering the dirt paths. It was a vacuum. Reese felt the hair on her arms stand up. It was the quiet, the specific, oppressive silence that precedes a storm. She saw Briggs shift in the lead vehicle, his posture tightening. He felt it too. The radio crackled with a burst of static, then the calm, measured tone of the Overwatch team. They had spotted movement on the ridgeline 300 meters out. Before the message could even be fully processed, the world exploded. A massive IED buried in the road detonated directly beneath the lead MRAP. The sound wasn't just a noise. It was a physical force that punched the air out of Reese's lungs. The massive vehicle, weighing several tons, was tossed into the air like a toy, landing on its side in a plume of orange flame and black smoke. The shockwave slammed into Reese's truck, rattling the heavy armor and throwing Kowalski onto the floorboards. For a heartbeat, there was a ringing, high-pitched vacuum of sound, and then the screaming started. The ambush was perfectly synchronized. As soon as the lead vehicle was disabled, the ridgeline erupted in a rhythmic thud-thud-thud of heavy machine guns. Bullets began to hammer against the side of the trucks like hail on a tin roof. The order to dismount came over the radio, distorted and frantic. Reese didn't think, she reacted. She grabbed her standard-issue carbine, kicked open the heavy door, and rolled into the dirt. The air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber, sulfur, and the metallic tang of blood. Everything was chaos. Sergeant Ortiz was screaming orders, trying to establish a perimeter while his men were pinned down behind whatever cover they could find. The enemy had the high ground, looking down into the kill zone of the valley. Every time an American soldier tried to peer over a rock or a wheel well, a precision shot would kick up the dirt inches from their head. They were being picked apart. "Callahan, ammo, now!" Ortiz's voice rose above the din of the gunfire. He was 20 feet away, suppressed by a PKM machine gun that was chewing up the boulder he was using for cover. Reese didn't hesitate. She scrambled back to the truck, hauled 2 heavy cans of ammunition out of the rack, and sprinted. She didn't run like a typical support soldier. She moved with a low, predatory grace, zigzagging through the fire, staying low to the ground. She slid into the dirt beside Ortiz, the impact jarring her knees, and shoved the cans toward him. He didn't even look at her, his face a mask of sweat and grime as he fed a fresh belt into his SAW. Then the sound that changed everything echoed through the valley. It wasn't the roar of an explosion, but a frantic, cracking voice over the radio. "Briggs is hit. Sniper is down. I repeat, Briggs is down." Reese's heart skipped a beat. She looked toward a small, 2-story mud structure on the edge of the village where Briggs and Haynes had set up an elevated firing position just moments after the blast. She could see Haynes on the roof, his silhouette small and vulnerable. He was kneeling over Briggs, his hands moving frantically, trying to stem a flow of blood that was soaking into the tan dust of the rooftop. Every time Haynes tried to reach for the Barrett, a flurry of rounds would impact the low parapet of the roof, forcing him to duck. The enemy knew exactly where the threat was, and they were keeping the big rifle out of the fight. "We need that gun," Ortiz yelled into his mic, his voice cracking with desperation. "Haynes, get on the Barrett." "I can't." Haynes screamed back, his voice bordering on hysterics. "I can't get to it. They're zeroed in on me. Briggs is bleeding out. I need a medic up here." But there was no medic who could reach them, and no one was willing to run into the teeth of a sniper's nest. The squad was being suppressed by at least 2 different marksmen on the ridge, and without Briggs to counter them, it was only a matter of minutes before the insurgents closed the distance and finished them off. Reese looked at the ladder leaning against the side of the building. It was an old, rickety thing made of wood and scavenged metal. She looked at the ridgeline, calculating the distance, the angle of the sun, and the speed of the wind blowing through the draw. She could see the muzzle flashes now, 3 of them positioned in a staggered line along the rocks. They were good, but they were arrogant. They thought they had won. Without a word to Ortiz, Reese stood up. "Callahan, what the hell are you doing? Get down." Ortiz reached for her sleeve, but she was already gone. She didn't run toward the ladder, she flowed toward it. She used the smoke from the burning MRAP as a screen, moving through the haze like a phantom. She reached the base of the ladder just as a burst of machine gun fire shredded the mud wall beside her head. She didn't flinch. She climbed. Each rung was a gamble, a vertical sprint into the line of sight of the men on the hill. She reached the top and rolled over the edge of the roof, landing in a pile of brass casings and dried mud. Haynes looked at her, his eyes wide with shock. He was covered in Briggs's blood, his face pale. "Callahan, what are you? Get out of here. You're gonna get killed." "Move," Reese said. Her voice was different. It wasn't the quiet, submissive tone of the ammo carrier. It was cold. It was absolute. She crawled over to Briggs. The big man was conscious, but his skin was turning a gray, waxy color. The bullet had taken him in the shoulder, missing the plate and tearing through the subclavian artery. He was dying. His eyes, usually so sharp, were clouded with pain, but when they landed on Reese, something flickered. He saw the way she was looking at the rifle. He saw the way her hands reached for the heavy steel of the Barrett. "You," Briggs wheezed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "I've got it, Sergeant," Reese whispered. "Just stay still. Help is coming." She grabbed the Barrett M82 and pulled it toward her. The rifle was a beast, nearly 30 pounds of parkerized steel and high-impact polymer. To an untrained person, it was a clumsy, heavy club. To Reese, it felt like an extension of her own skeleton. She settled behind the glass, her cheek resting against the cold cheekpiece. She didn't need to check the settings. She could feel where Briggs had it dialed. She made a minor adjustment for the shifting wind, a 3-click hold to the left, and peered through the scope. The world narrowed. The screaming, the explosions, the smell of death, it all vanished. There was only the reticle, the wind, and the targets. She saw the first sniper. He was tucked behind a jagged rock, 750 yards out. He was confident, leaning out to take another shot at the troops below. Reese took a deep breath, let half of it out, and held. Her finger took up the slack on the trigger until she felt the wall. In that heartbeat, she wasn't an ammo carrier. She wasn't a girl hiding from a legacy. She was a predator. The Barrett roared. The massive muzzle brake redirected the gases in a violent plume of dust, and the recoil slammed into her shoulder like a physical punch. But Reese didn't move. She watched through the scope as the .50 caliber round traveled the distance in a fraction of a second. It didn't just hit the insurgent, it disintegrated the cover he was hiding behind and took him with it. He disappeared in a spray of red and gray. Holy mother of! Haynes started, but Reese was already cycling the bolt. The heavy brass casing spun away, clattering against the roof. She didn't wait for a reaction. She pivoted the rifle, searching for the second shooter. He had seen his partner die and was trying to retreat into a crevice. She tracked him, her mind performing the lead calculations automatically. He was moving, so she held 2 mils ahead of his path. She squeezed. The second shot echoed through the valley, a thunderous boom that seemed to silence the smaller rifles for a moment. The round caught the runner in the lower back, folding him in half and tossing him down the slope like a rag doll. Below on the ground, the soldiers of Alpha Company stopped. They knew the sound of Briggs's rifle, but this was different. The cadence was faster, the precision more clinical. Ortiz looked up at the roof, squinting through the dust. He saw the small figure behind the massive gun, the steady, rhythmic movement of a professional at work. Reese found the machine gunner next. He was the biggest threat to the squad. He was nestled in a stone-reinforced bunker, his PKM raking the valley floor. Reese adjusted her elevation. The distance was nearly 1,000 yards. At that range, the bullet would drop significantly, and the wind in the middle of the valley would push it off course. She felt the air against her skin, sensed the way the heat waves were shimmering off the rocks, mirage, a sniper's best friend and worst enemy. She dialed the turret on top of the scope, 2 crisp clicks. She fired. The round punched through the stone wall as if it were made of wet cardboard. The machine gun fell silent instantly. For the next 5 minutes, the rooftop became a focal point of absolute lethality. Reese Callahan, the girl who didn't want to be noticed, was systematically dismantling an entire ambush. She fired 6 more times. Each shot was a masterpiece of ballistics. She took out a spotter, a rocket-propelled grenade team, and 2 more riflemen who tried to flee over the back of the ridge. By the time the Barrett's magazine was empty, the ridgeline was a graveyard. The heavy volume of fire that had been pinning the squad down had vanished, replaced by a stunned, ringing silence. Reese let go of the rifle and sat back, her chest heaving. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving her hands shaking and her ears ringing despite the protection. She looked down at her hands, small, calloused, and stained with the grease of ammunition crates. Haynes was staring at her as if she had just grown a second head. Who are you?" he stammered. Reese didn't answer. She turned back to Briggs. The sergeant was still alive, his eyes fixed on her. He was coughing, a wet, rattling sound, but there was a faint, knowing smile on his bloody lips. He reached out a trembling hand and gripped her forearm. "Eli," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You're Eli's girl." Reese felt a chill go through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She didn't nod, but she didn't pull away either. She just sat there in the dust of a foreign land, the weight of her father's name finally catching up to her. The medevac birds arrived 20 minutes later, their rotors churning the air into a frenzy of dust and noise. The parajumpers dropped down, their movements efficient and rapid as they stabilized Briggs and prepared him for transport. Haynes went with him, still looking back at Reese as the helicopter lifted off, his expression a mix of awe and confusion. The rest of the company began the grim task of recovering the bodies from the lead MRAP and securing the perimeter. The atmosphere had shifted. The soldiers moved differently around Reese now. They didn't ignore her. They watched her out of the corners of their eyes, whispering to one another as she walked back to the trucks. The invisible girl was gone, replaced by something they didn't understand. Ortiz approached her as she was cleaning the dust off her carbine. He stood there for a long moment, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "The captain wants to see you, Callahan. Now." Reese followed him to the command tent that had been hastily erected back at the forward operating base a few hours later. The ride back had been the longest of her life. Kowalski hadn't said a single word. He had just stared at her with a kind of terrified reverence, as if she were a ghost that had suddenly decided to start speaking. Inside the tent, Captain Morris was standing over a map table. He was a career officer, a man who valued regulations and clear lines of authority. When Reese entered, he didn't look up immediately. He finished marking a coordinate on the map, then straightened his back and turned to face her. "Sit down, Corporal," he said. Reese sat. She kept her back straight, her eyes fixed on a point just above the captain's head. "I just got off the radio with the medevac team," Morris began, his voice low and dangerous. "Staff Sergeant Briggs is in surgery. The doctors say he's going to live, but he's lost his arm." He also told the flight medic something interesting. He said that while he was lying on that roof, he saw a ghost. Morris walked around the table, his boots thumping against the plywood floor. He stopped directly in front of Reese. "I've been looking at your file for the last hour, Callahan. Or should I say the lack of a file? It says here you grew up in Montana, that you joined the Army right out of high school, that you scored exceptionally well on your SVAB, but you specifically requested a MOS in logistics and support. No marksmanship awards, no sniper school, no advanced infantry training, nothing." Reese remained silent, and yet Morris continued, leaning in close. "I have a dozen eyewitness reports saying that you picked up a Barrett M82, a weapon you are not qualified to handle, and neutralized 5 high-value targets at distances exceeding 800 meters. One of those shots was a moving target at 1,000. That's not luck, Corporal. That's world-class. That's the kind of shooting that only a handful of people on this planet can do." He threw a folder onto the table. It slid across the map and hit Reese's hand. "So I did a little more digging. I looked into your mother's maiden name, Callahan, and then I looked at your father. I had to go through some redacted files to find it, but eventually I found a match. Eli Vance, Master Gunnery Sergeant Uzm Rhett, one of the most prolific snipers in the history of the Marine Corps, the man who literally wrote the book on long-range engagements." Morris stared at her, his eyes searching hers for a crack. "You've been lying to the United States Army for 2 years. You've been hiding your identity, hiding your skills, and taking up a slot as an ammo carrier when you could have been one of the most effective assets in this theater. Why?" Reese finally looked at him. Her eyes were hard, reflecting a deep-seated pain that went back much further than this deployment. "Because I didn't want the rifle, Captain. I didn't want the life." "You don't get to choose that," Morris snapped. "Not when you have a gift like that, not when men are dying because you're too busy trying to find yourself in the supply chain." "It wasn't about finding myself," Reese said, her voice rising slightly. "It was about escaping him. My father didn't just write the book, Captain, he lived it. Every dinner, every weekend, every summer, it was all about the shot. Windage, elevation, heart rate, cold bore theory. I was 5 years old when he put a rifle in my hands. By the time I was 12, I was out shooting his students at Quantico. He didn't see a daughter, he saw a project. He saw a legacy." She stood up, her fists clenched at her sides. "I watched what that rifle did to him. I watched him become a man who only saw the world through a piece of glass. He didn't know how to love anything that wasn't a target. When he died, he didn't leave me a house or money. He left me his logs, thousands of pages of men he had killed, the weather conditions when they died, the way their bodies fell. I didn't want that. I wanted to be a person. I wanted to be invisible because being visible meant being a killer." The silence in the tent was heavy. Morris looked at her, and for a moment the anger in his eyes softened into something resembling pity. But it was fleeting. He was a commander, and he had a war to win. "I understand, Corporal, I really do," Morris said. "But the world is a cruel place, and it doesn't care what you want. You saved your squad today. You saved Ortiz, and you saved Haynes, and you saved Briggs. If you hadn't picked up that rifle, I'd be writing 5 letters to families back home tonight. You can hate the legacy all you want, but you can't deny the results." He sat down at his desk and pulled out a stack of transfer orders. "As of this moment, your status as a support specialist is revoked. I'm moving you to the Scout Sniper platoon. You'll be taking Briggs's spot until a replacement can be found, though I suspect there isn't a replacement for you in this entire brigade." "Captain, I can't," Reese whispered. "You can and you will," Morris said, his voice firm. "That's an order. You have a debt to the men you serve with, Callahan. You have a debt to use the tools you were given. You spent 6 months trying to be a ghost. Well, the ghosts found you. Now get your gear. You're moving into the sniper bay tonight." Reese walked out of the tent, the bright Afghan sun blinding her for a moment. She felt as though the earth had shifted beneath her feet. The secret she had guarded so fiercely was gone, shattered by the very skill she had tried to bury. As she walked toward the barracks, she passed the motor pool. A group of soldiers was gathered around the Barrett M82, which had been recovered from the roof and brought back for cleaning. They stopped talking as she approached. Kowalski was there, holding a cleaning rod, looking at the rifle with a newfound sense of dread. He looked up at Reese, his mouth opening as if to say something, then closing it again. He stepped aside, clearing a path for her. Reese didn't look at the rifle. She didn't look at the men. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the mountains were already beginning to turn a dark, ominous purple. The wind was picking up, blowing the dust across the base in swirling, ghostly patterns. She could feel the weight of the rifle on her shoulder, even though she wasn't carrying it. She could feel the wall of the trigger against her finger, the rhythmic thumping of her heart, the cold, analytical part of her brain already calculating the distance to the furthest peak. She had tried to run from her father's shadow, but she had forgotten one thing about shadows. They are longest when the sun is setting. That night, the barracks were quiet. Reese sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the small, leather-bound notebook she had kept hidden at the bottom of her sea bag. It was the only thing she had kept of her father's, not the logs, not the medals, but a small book of sketches he had made of the Montana wilderness. On the last page, in his cramped, precise handwriting, he had written a single sentence. Asterisk, the rifle is just a tool, Reese. The eye is the soul. Asterisk, she closed the book and tucked it under her pillow. She knew she wouldn't sleep. She could still hear the roar of the Barrett, still see the way the dust kicked up when the rounds hit. She knew that from this day forward, she would never be just an ammo carrier again. The men would look at her with respect, yes, but also with a distance. She was a sniper now. She was a dealer in distances and death. She thought about the man on the ridge, the first one she had killed. She wondered if he had a daughter. She wondered if he had spent his life trying to be something else before the war found him. In the darkness of the tent, Reese Callahan finally let a single tear trail down her cheek, cutting a path through the dust and grime of the day's battle. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her touch rough and certain. The next morning, when the sun rose over the Helmand province, Reese was already awake. She was dressed in her tactical gear, her hair pulled back tight, her expression a mask of professional indifference. She walked over to the armory and stood before the window. The armorer, a grizzly old sergeant who had seen more than his fair share of combat, looked at her for a long moment. He didn't ask for her ID. He didn't ask for her paperwork. He reached back into the rack and pulled out the Barrett M82. He laid it on the counter between them. It was clean now, the blood and dust scrubbed away, the steel gleaming in the morning light. "She's a heavy bitch," the sergeant said softly. Reese reached out and ran her hand along the barrel. It was cold. "I know," she said. She picked up the rifle, the weight of it familiar and grounding. She slung it over her shoulder and walked out into the light. The convoy was already forming up, the engines of the MRAPs growling in anticipation. Ortiz was there waiting for her. He gave her a sharp, curt nod, then pointed toward the lead vehicle. "You're with me, Callahan," he said. "Keep your eyes on the ridge." "Copy that, Sergeant," Reese replied. She climbed into the truck, settling into the seat that had once belonged to Briggs. She checked the scope, confirmed the 0, and looked out the window. The mountains were still there, sharp and unforgiving. The silence was gone, replaced by the purposeful noise of a unit in motion. Reese Callahan was no longer a ghost. She was a weapon. And as the convoy rolled out of the gate and back into the heart of the valley, she knew that the war was just beginning. She wasn't just Eli's daughter anymore. She was the one who would bring the rest of them home. The dust rose up behind the trucks, a long, trailing cloud that obscured the base and the safety of the wire. Ahead lay the unknown, the heat, and the hidden enemies in the rocks. But Reese wasn't afraid. She adjusted her grip on the rifle, her breathing slow and steady, her eyes sharp. She was ready for the shot. The road wound deeper into the mountains, a narrow ribbon of dirt through a landscape of fire and stone. Somewhere in the distance, a bird of prey circled in the thermals, watching. Below, the steel and the soldiers moved as one, a singular force driven by duty and the cold, hard reality of survival. And at the front of it all, a young woman with a heavy rifle and a heavier heart watched the world through a piece of glass, waiting for the moment when the silence would break again. She knew it would. It always did. But this time, she wouldn't be hiding. She would be the storm. As the sun climbed higher, baking the earth and shimmering the air, Reese felt a strange sense of peace. The struggle was over. The choice had been made for her, and in the clarity of that realization, the burden of her father's name felt a little lighter. She wasn't him. She would never be him. But she had his eyes and she had his hands, and in this place at this time, that was exactly what the world needed. The convoy turned a corner, disappearing into the jagged moor of a canyon. The sound of the engines faded, swallowed by the vastness of the desert. There was only the heat, the dust, and the long, waiting shadows of the ridges. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a sniper waited for her mark. The air in the small, cramped office was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of a dying fluorescent light that flickered with an irritating, rhythmic buzz. Commander Morris sat behind a desk cluttered with maps, spent casings used as paperweights, and a thick layer of dust that seemed to coat everything in the room. He looked older than he had just a week ago, the lines around his eyes deepening into ravines of exhaustion. He leaned forward, the springs of his chair groaning under his weight, and fixed Reese with a look that was both predatory and weary. He told her she had finally become somebody, a sentiment that tasted like ash in her mouth. She had spent her entire life trying to be nobody, trying to let the shadow of her past swallow her whole. But the events of the last few days had dragged her into a spotlight she never wanted. Now Morris was telling her she had a choice to make, though they both knew that in this world, choices were often just illusions presented by those with the power to enforce them. Reese felt a coldness settle in her chest, a familiar sensation that usually preceded a storm. When Morris mentioned that intelligence had flagged a high-value target, she expected the usual names, the local warlords or insurgent leaders who rose and fell like the desert tides. But then he said the name, Yuri Volkov. The syllables felt like shards of ice. It wasn't just a name, it was a ghost story. Her blood didn't just go cold, it seemed to stop flowing entirely, turning into a heavy, frozen sludge in her veins. She knew that name from the quietest hours of her childhood, from the nights when her father, Eli, would sit on the porch with a bottle of cheap rye and a 1,000-yard stare. He'd spoken it only once, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that sounded like he was confessing a sin. Volkov was the student who had gone rogue, the one man her father truly feared, not because of his skill with a rifle, but because of the emptiness behind his eyes. Morris watched her reaction with the clinical detachment of a man observing a lab rat. He explained that Volkov was active again, moving through the jagged peaks of the mountains to the north. He wasn't just taking contracts anymore. He was training insurgents, turning disorganized fighters into surgical instruments of death. He was picking off coalition forces with a terrifying efficiency that suggested he was doing more than just fulfilling a mission. He was hunting. Morris's voice dropped a register as he admitted they had already lost 3 of their best snipers trying to pin the man down. Each one had been found with a single, perfect shot to the head, or worse, left to die slowly as a lure for their comrades. Reese stared at him, her mind racing. She asked why he was telling her this, though the answer was already forming in the pit of her stomach. Morris met her gaze with an unblinking intensity and told her the words she dreaded most. She was going after him. The suggestion felt like an execution sentence. Reese looked at him as if he'd asked her to step into a minefield without a map. She protested, stating the obvious fact that she wasn't a sniper, at least not in the way the military defined the term. She was a survivor, a girl who had been raised by a man who treated a rifle like a holy relic, but she wasn't a professional. Morris didn't flinch. He reminded her of the 5 hostiles she had dropped at extreme range with a weapon she'd never even touched before. In his eyes, that wasn't just luck, it was a pedigree. He dropped a heavy manila folder on the desk between them, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. The folder contained the life and crimes of Yuri Volkov, 58 years of shadow and blood. He was a product of the old USSR, trained by the most ruthless instructors the Soviet Union had to offer. When the empire collapsed, Volkov didn't retire. He simply changed employers. Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, wherever the world was burning, Volkov was there to fan the flames. Lately, he had made these mountains his home. Reese didn't touch the folder, as if the paper itself might be contaminated. She argued that one engagement didn't make her qualified for a high-stakes hunt against a legend. But Morris leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. He detailed the deaths of the 3 scout snipers Volkov had killed. He described how Volkov had shot one man through a 2-inch gap in his body armor from over 1,200 meters away. He told her about the second man, who had been left to bleed out slowly, his screams echoing through the valley while his spotter watched through a scope, unable to help without exposing himself to the same fate. Volkov wasn't just a killer, he was an artist of misery. Reese's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. She demanded to know why they didn't just send a full tactical team, a real unit capable of leveling a mountainside. Morris sighed, a sound of pure frustration. They had tried, he admitted, twice. Both times the teams had found nothing but empty brass and the cold remains of a campfire. Volkov knew the terrain better than the people who had lived there for generations. He knew the coalition's tactics, their movement patterns, and their technological limitations. He was always 3 steps ahead, a ghost who disappeared into the mist the moment things turned against him. But Morris pointed out that there was one variable Volkov couldn't possibly account for. He didn't know about her. He didn't know that Eli Callahan's daughter was in the theater, and he certainly didn't know she possessed the same preternatural talent for the long shot that her father had once possessed. Morris believed she was the only advantage they had left, the only wild card in a game where the house was losing. He gave her the departure time, 0600 the next morning. She would have a spotter, full tactical support, and the best gear the armory could provide. But he made it clear that this was her mission. It was her call to make, a burden she didn't want but couldn't seem to shake. When she asked what would happen if she said no, Morris didn't lie. He told her he would find someone else, and that person would almost certainly die, just like the others. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Reese wanted to walk out of the office, to disappear back into the anonymity of the ranks, or better yet, to leave this war behind entirely. But the image of Sergeant Briggs, bleeding out on that rooftop while he looked at her with a desperate, dying trust, wouldn't leave her mind. She had stepped across a line that day, and there was no going back. She looked at Morris, her voice barely a whisper, and asked who her spotter would be. The answer surprised her. Sergeant Haynes. The man had barely looked at her since the ambush, and when he did, his eyes were filled with a mixture of resentment and confusion. Reese had assumed he hated her for the secret she'd kept, or perhaps for the fact that a nobody like her had saved his life when he should have been the one in control. She found him an hour later in the dim light of the armory. The room smelled of CLP and cold steel, a sanctuary for those who found peace in the maintenance of machines. Haynes was hunched over a workbench, meticulously cleaning his rifle with a focused intensity that bordered on the obsessive. He didn't look up when she approached, but the set of his shoulders told her he knew exactly who it was. When she asked why he had volunteered for a suicide mission with someone he didn't even like, he finally set down his cleaning rod and looked at her. His eyes were weary, but there was a new kind of respect there, or perhaps just a shared recognition of pain. He told her that he'd seen what she did on that roof, and more importantly, he understood the weight of the secret she was carrying. He revealed that his own father had been a ranger, a man who had died in the dust of Mogadishu when Haynes was only 8 years old. All his life, people had expected him to be a carbon copy of the hero his father had been, to carry a legacy that felt like a suit of armor 3 sizes too small. He understood why Reese had wanted to disappear, why she had hidden the name Callahan behind a wall of silence. He wasn't there because he liked her. He was there because he knew they were both fighting the same ghosts. He told her to get some sleep, warning her that the mountains would demand everything she had to give. Reese didn't sleep. She spent the night in her bunk, the folder from Morris spread out before her like a map of a nightmare. She stared at the grainy surveillance photos of Yuri Volkov. He was tall and lean, his face a map of scars and sharp angles. His eyes, even in a low-resolution photograph, looked hauntingly calm. They were the eyes of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that he was a monster. She read the after-action reports, the psychological profiles, and the intelligence summaries until the words began to blur together. Everything pointed to a man who was patient beyond reason, a hunter who could lie still in the freezing mud for days just to wait for a 3-second window of opportunity. As she sat in the dark, a memory surfaced from her childhood, unbidden and sharp. She was 14, sitting on the porch of their cabin in the mountains of Montana. Her father was staring out into the pines, the orange glow of his cigarette the only light in the darkness. He had been talking about a student he'd once trained, a Russian who could read the wind as if it were a spoken language. He described the man as brilliant but cold, a shooter who didn't pull the trigger to survive or to protect, but because he enjoyed the moment of impact. Her father had never told her what happened to that student, only that nothing good ever comes of a man who loses his humanity to the scope. Now, Reese realized her father hadn't just been telling a story, he'd been issuing a warning. She wondered if Volkov knew her father was dead, or if he was still looking for him in every face he saw through his lens. The convoy rolled out of the base before the sun had even begun to touch the horizon. The 2 MRAPs and the supply truck rumbled through the jagged mountain passes, their engines groaning as they fought against the steep inclines. Reese sat across from Haynes, the heavy weight of the Barrett, .50 caliber rifle resting against her legs. The weapon felt like a living thing, an ancient beast that was waiting for her to wake it up. Haynes watched her, a faint, knowing smirk playing on his lips. He noticed her checking and rechecking her magazines, her hands moving in a restless, repetitive motion. When he asked if she was nervous, she denied it, but they both knew she was lying. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed, the landscape turning into a desolate moonscape of gray rock and stunted scrub brush. When they reached the forward operating base, a tiny collection of sandbags and prefab shacks clinging to a cliffside, they were briefed by a young lieutenant whose hands shook as he pointed to a map. Volkov's last known position was a ridge 15 kilometers to the north, a place the locals called the Devil's Spine. He had been picking off patrols in the valley below, moving with a ghost-like agility that baffled their drone operators. The lieutenant's voice was thin, filled with the kind of dread that comes from fighting an enemy you can't see. He told them that once they found Volkov, what happened next was up to them. There would be no extraction teams on standby, no air support if things went south. They were on their own. They moved out at dusk, the light fading into a deep, bruised purple. Each step was a battle against the terrain. The 60-pound packs cut into their shoulders, and the loose shale threatened to send them sliding down into the abyss with every footfall. Haynes took the lead, his pace steady and relentless. Reese followed, her mind automatically clicking into the mode her father had drilled into her. She wasn't just walking, she was calculating. She noted the way the wind whipped through the canyons, the way the shadows pooled in the crevices of the rocks, and the distance between every possible piece of cover. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the world was bathed in a cold, silvery moonlight that made everything look like a dream. Haynes set up the spotting scope, his movements practiced and silent. Reese unpacked the Barrett, her fingers working the bolts and checking the optics with a muscle memory that felt like it belonged to someone else. The rifle was a heavy, comforting weight, a tool designed for one purpose and one purpose only. She settled into a prone position, the cold stone biting through her gear, and peered through the scope. The valley below was a vast, silent expanse of shadows. For hours, they saw nothing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind. Then Haynes whispered two words that made her heart skip a beat. Got movement. A figure was moving through the rocks about 1,000 meters out. It wasn't the frantic, hurried movement of a local insurgent. It was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly efficient. The figure seemed to blend into the shadows, disappearing for minutes at a time only to reappear 20 yards further down the slope. Reese centered the crosshairs on the shape, her breathing slowing to a crawl. She couldn't see a face, only the silhouette of a man who moved like a predator. Haynes checked the thermal, but the figure was using some kind of heat-shielding blanket, a trick of the trade that only a professional would know. They waited, the tension between them thick enough to touch. Then the silence was shattered. A radio crackled to life in Haynes's ear. A small patrol was moving through the valley floor, completely unaware that they were being watched by the deadliest sniper in the world. Haynes hissed that they had to warn them, but Reese knew the cost. If they broke radio silence, Volkov would know exactly where they were. If they didn't, the men below were as good as dead. It was a choice between the mission and the lives of men she didn't even know. She didn't hesitate. She keyed her radio, her voice a sharp, urgent command, telling the patrol to take cover immediately. The valley erupted into chaos. The soldiers below scattered, diving behind rocks and vehicles as a volley of gunfire rained down from the ridge. But as Reese scanned the area, she realized something was wrong. The flashes of light weren't coming from the figure she'd been tracking. They were coming from a completely different direction. It was a decoy, a remote-fired weapon, or a secondary shooter meant to draw their attention. Volkov hadn't been in the valley at all. He had been waiting for them to reveal themselves. Reese's breath hitched in her throat as she realized the depth of the trap. He knew, she whispered, the words barely audible over the distant sound of the firefight. He knew we were here. Haynes spun around, his spotting scope sweeping the ridgeline behind them, but it was too late. The first bullet punched into the dirt just inches from Reese's head, showering her with grit and dust. The sound of the shot arrived a split second later, a heavy, booming crack that echoed through the mountains like thunder. Volkov wasn't in front of them. He was behind them, perched on a higher peak that gave him a perfect line of sight on their position. Reese rolled to her side, grabbing the Barrett and scrambling for the meager cover of a jagged boulder as a second round whistled past her ear. Haynes was shouting, his voice a frantic blur of noise, but she couldn't process the words. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. They were pinned. Volkov had the high ground, the better angle, and the element of surprise. He was toying with them, his shots landing just close enough to keep them from moving but not yet aimed to kill. He was zeroing in, adjusting for the wind and the drop with the cold precision of a mathematician. Reese knew that if they stayed behind the boulder, he would eventually find an angle or wait until they ran out of water and patience. She looked at Haynes, who was bleeding from a small scrape on his forehead where a stone splinter had caught him. He looked at her with a desperate, wide-eyed intensity. They both knew what was coming. Reese felt a strange, sudden clarity wash over her. The fear was still there, but it was pushed to the background, replaced by the lessons her father had taught her in the woods of Montana. She didn't think about the politics of the war or the orders Morris had given her. She thought about the wind, the arc of a bullet, and the man on the ridge who thought he was the only hunter on the mountain. She grabbed the Barrett, her hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through her system. She told Haynes to stay down, and before he could protest, she lunged out from behind the cover. She didn't run away. She ran toward a small outcropping of rock 20 meters to her left, a position that offered a slightly better angle on the peak above. Bullets chased her, kicking up plumes of dust at her heels, the crack thump of the rounds sounding like the snapping of giant fingers. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her, but she didn't stop. She swung the heavy rifle around, the bipod digging into the dirt, and searched the upper ridge through her scope. There, a tiny, almost imperceptible flash of light against the dark stone. It was the reflection off a lens or perhaps the muzzle flash of Volkov's rifle. She didn't wait. She adjusted for the extreme incline, held her breath at the bottom of her exhale, and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared, the massive recoil slamming into her shoulder with enough force to bruise the bone. The sound was deafening in the narrow canyon. She watched through the scope, but the muzzle blast had kicked up a cloud of dust that obscured her view. When it cleared, the upper ridge was silent. Nothing moved. Haynes called out to her, asking if she'd got him, but she couldn't give him an answer. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the gunfire. Then a voice drifted across the void. It wasn't a shout, but the acoustics of the valley carried it with haunting clarity. It was a man's voice, accented and calm, sounding almost like a teacher praising a student. "Eli taught you well, little one," the voice said. The words sent a wave of nausea through Reese. Volkov didn't just know her father. He had recognized her style, her rhythm, her soul through the barrel of a gun. The voice continued, cold and mocking, telling her that shooting was only half the lesson. The other half, he said, was knowing when to run. A second later, a dark object sailed through the air, tumbling end over end before landing 10 feet from Reese's position. It was a grenade. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. She saw the metallic glint of the safety lever flying away, heard the dry hiss of the fuse. She didn't have time to scream. She threw herself backward, away from the outcrop, as the world exploded into a blinding wall of white light and searing heat. The shockwave slammed into her, tossing her body like a rag doll. Shrapnel screamed through the air, slicing through her gear and grazing her skin. Her world turned into a blur of ringing ears and the metallic taste of blood. She felt hands on her, dragging her through the dirt, but she couldn't find her feet. Haynes was shouting something, his face a distorted mask of panic, but the sound was drowned out by the roar in her head. She looked up, her vision swimming, and saw him. Yuri Volkov was standing on the ridge above them, a silhouette against the moon. He wasn't aiming his rifle. It was slung casually over his shoulder. He stood there for a long moment, simply watching them, a dark god looking down on his creation. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised one hand in a wave, a gesture that was both a farewell and a promise. He turned and vanished into the darkness as if he had never been there at all. The trek back to the forward operating base was a blurred odyssey of pain. Reese's ankle was twisted and swollen, every step sending a lightning bolt of agony up her leg. Haynes stayed by her side, his hand firmly on her arm, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline for a threat that he knew was no longer there. Volkov could have killed them both a dozen times over, but he hadn't. He had let them go, and that realization was more damaging than any wound. He had played with them, demonstrated his absolute superiority, and then walked away, leaving them with the crushing weight of their own inadequacy. By the time they reached the gate of the base, the first rays of dawn were bleeding over the horizon. The light felt intrusive, exposing the battered and broken state they were in. The medic on duty, a harried man with tired eyes, forced Reese to sit on a cot and began assessing her injuries. He noted the bleeding from her ears, the result of the blast, and the various cuts and bruises that covered her body. Haynes stood nearby, his arms crossed, his face a grim mask of exhaustion. He finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly, telling her she should have run when the grenade landed. Reese looked at him, her eyes vacant and cold. She told him she had run, but they both knew it wasn't about the physical act of moving. It was about the moment of hesitation, the split second where she had been paralyzed by the shadow of her father's past. The medic finished wrapping her ankle and gave her a dose of something for the pain, but it didn't touch the coldness in her heart. She sat there in the silence of the medical tent, the sound of Volkov's voice still echoing in her ears. He had called her little one. He had spoken of her father as if they were old friends, or perhaps old rivals. She realized then that this mission wasn't just a military operation. It was a reckoning. Volkov hadn't stayed in these mountains just to train insurgents or kill soldiers. He had been waiting for a Callahan to show up. He had been waiting for the only person who could give him a challenge, or perhaps the only person who could finally end his long, blood-soaked journey. As the drugs began to dull the sharp edges of her physical pain, Reese looked at the Barrett rifle leaning against the tent pole. It was scarred and dusty, but it remained unbroken. She realized that Volkov hadn't just sent a message, he had issued a challenge. He had shown her that she wasn't ready, that she was still the little girl sitting on the porch listening to her father's ghost stories. But he had also given her the one thing she needed to survive, a reason to keep fighting. She wouldn't disappear anymore. She wouldn't hide behind a false name or a quiet life. The hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The mountains were still there, and somewhere in their high, frozen reaches, Yuri Volkov was waiting for her to grow up. The weight of the realization sat heavy in her gut, a different kind of burden than the rifle or the pack. She thought about Morris and the way he had looked at her in that office. He had known, or at least suspected, that this would happen. He had used her as bait, dangling the Callahan name like a lure in front of a shark. She should have been angry, should have wanted to scream at him for the lives he was gambling with, but the anger was drowned out by a cold, sharpening focus. She looked at Haynes, who was watching her with a strange, contemplative expression. He asked her what she was thinking, and for the first time since the ambush, she spoke with a voice that didn't shake. She told him she was thinking about the wind. The medic told her she needed to rest, but Reese knew sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the silhouette of Volkov on that ridge. She saw the way he moved, the way he breathed, the way he existed as a part of the mountain itself. To beat him, she wouldn't just have to be a better shot. She would have to become something else entirely. She would have to find the part of herself that she'd spent years trying to suppress, the part that her father had seen and tried to warn her about. The part that didn't just shoot to survive, but shot because it was the only thing that made the world make sense. As the sun rose higher, casting long, jagged shadows across the base, Reese stood up, testing her wrapped ankle. It throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, but it held her weight. She walked out of the tent, Haynes following close behind without a word. They walked toward the command center, where the maps and the intel and the ghosts were waiting. The air was crisp and biting, the scent of the mountains calling to her like a siren song. She wasn't the girl who had arrived on that convoy yesterday. That girl had been blown apart on a rocky ridge by a man who knew her better than she knew herself. The woman who remained was something new, something forged in fire and shale. The hunt for Yuri Volkov was no longer a mission given by a commander in a dusty office. It was hers. And this time, she wouldn't be the one running. The air in the small, dimly lit room felt heavy, as if the very molecules were saturated with the weight of the legacy Reese Callahan had spent her entire life trying to both outrun and honor. She sat at the scarred wooden table, her hands resting flat against the cool surface, watching the dust motes dance in the single shaft of late afternoon sun that managed to pierce the grime of the window. This was the moment her father, Eli, had spent years preparing her for, even when he claimed he was just teaching her how to survive. He hadn't just been teaching her to shoot. He had been teaching her how to exist in the crosshairs of a world that never stopped watching. Morris appeared in the doorway exactly an hour later, his presence announced by the heavy thud of his boots and the grim set of his jaw. He didn't offer a greeting, and he didn't ask how she was holding up after the harrowing events of the previous day. He simply pulled out a metal chair, the legs screeching against the concrete floor, and sat across from her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes searching hers for a sign of weakness he hoped he wouldn't find. Volkov had sent a message, he told her, his voice low and gravelly. Reese didn't blink. She told him she knew, reminding him she had been there when the first shots were fired, but Morris shook his head. This wasn't the chaotic roar of a battlefield. This was something far more deliberate. It was a real message, he explained, intercepted on a frequency they had been monitoring for weeks. Audio only. Morris reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rugged digital recorder. He set it on the table between them like a live grenade. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of something like pity in his eyes before he told her she needed to hear it. He pressed play. At first, there was only the rhythmic hiss of static, a white noise that seemed to fill the room and drown out the sound of Reese's own heartbeat. Then the static cleared, replaced by a voice that was chillingly composed. It was smooth, cultured, and carried a thick melodic accent, the voice of a man who sounded more like a philosophy professor than the world's most feared marksman. The voice addressed her directly, calling her Miss Callahan, then correcting itself to refer to her as the daughter of Eli. Volkov spoke of her father with a terrifying level of respect, calling him a great teacher who was patient and disciplined. He spoke of the lessons Eli had imparted, that shooting was never truly about the mechanical operation of a rifle, but about the alignment of the mind and the heart. He told her she had clearly inherited her father's heart, but he mused that she hadn't yet mastered his mind. Reese's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, her knuckles turning white. The calm, almost friendly tone of Volkov's voice made her skin crawl in a way that overt threats never could. It was the sound of a predator who had already cornered its prey and was now simply admiring the view. Volkov laid out his proposal with the clinical precision of a surgeon. In 3 days, he would be waiting at a specific set of coordinates being transmitted with the audio. He told her to come alone and to bring her rifle. It was a test, he said, a way to see if Eli had truly taught her the most important lesson of all. The recording cut out with a sharp click, leaving the room in a silence that felt deafening. Morris shut off the device, his gaze fixed on Reese. He stated the obvious: Volkov was challenging her to a duel. Reese felt a cold laugh bubble up in her throat, though it didn't reach her lips. She called it insane because it was. It was a relic of a different century, a romanticized version of murder that had no place in modern warfare. But Morris didn't look like he was joking. He leaned forward, the intensity in his eyes deepening. They had been chasing this ghost for months, losing men and resources while getting nowhere. Now, for reasons known only to himself, Volkov was offering to stand still. He was giving them a window, a single point in time and space where he could be found. If she could take him out, the hunt would finally end. Reese shook her head, the logic of the trap obvious to anyone with eyes. She asked what would happen if she failed. Morris didn't flinch. He admitted they would lose another sniper, but at least they would have a confirmed location. He promised a team would be standing by, ready to move in the second things went sideways. Reese corrected him, saying he meant when things went sideways. Morris didn't deny it. He told her it was her call. He wasn't going to order her to walk into a kill zone against a man who had more confirmed kills than she had years on this earth. But he made one thing clear. If she thought there was even a fraction of a chance she could pull it off, he would back her with everything the agency had. She looked over at Haynes, who had been standing in the corner of the room like a shadow. He was staring at the floor, his jaw set so tight it looked like it might snap. When she asked for his opinion, he didn't look up immediately. He eventually admitted he thought it was suicide, but he also knew her well enough to know she was going to do it anyway. There was a resigned sadness in his voice, the sound of a man watching a friend walk toward a cliff and knowing no words would stop them. The next 48 hours were a blur of focused, frantic preparation. Reese lived on the firing range, the world shrinking down to the size of her scope and the feel of the Barrett. 50 caliber rifle against her shoulder. She had to relearn the weapon's every quirk, every subtle shift in its weight and balance. She spent hours dialing in her zero, her fingers moving with practiced muscle memory as she adjusted the turrets for windage and elevation. She pushed herself harder than she ever had before, hitting targets at distances that made even the seasoned range officer uncomfortable. 1,500 meters, 1,800, 2,000. Each shot was a violent explosion that rattled her bones and filled her lungs with the acrid scent of burnt cordite. At those distances, the bullet's flight time was long enough to allow for a second of prayer, though Reese didn't pray. She calculated. She accounted for the rotation of the earth, the humidity in the air, and the slight, unpredictable thermals rising off the baking dirt. Every shot had to be a masterpiece of physics because she knew Volkov wouldn't give her a second chance. If she missed, she wouldn't even hear the shot that took her life. Haynes stayed by her side through it all. He was a silent sentinel, feeding her data from his spotting scope, adjusting her position by fractions of an inch, and never once suggesting she reconsider. He was the anchor to her kite, keeping her grounded while her mind drifted into the cold, analytical space required for long-range marksmanship. But she could see the encroaching shadows in his eyes. He had been a spotter long enough to know the brutal reality of a sniper duel. It wasn't like the movies. There was no glory in it, only the terrifying math of who could stay still the longest and who could breathe the steadiest under the pressure of imminent death. He knew the odds were stacked heavily against her. On the second night, with the duel looming like an executioner's axe, Reese found Haynes sitting outside the barracks. He was staring up at the vast canopy of stars, his silhouette dark against the pale moonlight. When she asked if he couldn't sleep, he gave a short, mirthless laugh and admitted he couldn't. They sat in the heavy silence of the desert night for a long time, the only sound the distant hum of a generator and the occasional scuttle of a nocturnal creature in the scrub. Haynes eventually spoke, his voice so quiet it was almost lost to the wind. He talked about his father, a man who had believed the hardest part of being a soldier wasn't the heat of battle or the roar of the guns. It was the waiting. It was the agonizing period of knowing exactly what was coming and being utterly powerless to stop the clock. Reese remarked that his father sounded like a smart man. Haynes agreed, though he added a bitter postscript. His father had been smart right up until the moment he got himself killed trying to save someone who hadn't even wanted to be saved. He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the darkness, listening for the faint click as it hit the ground. He confessed that he used to view his father as a hero, but now he wasn't so sure. He wondered if the man had just been stubborn, driven by a refusal to give up even when the cause was lost. Reese heard the unspoken subtext in his words. She asked if he thought she was being stubborn. Haynes looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the cold light of the stars. He told her he thought she was trying to prove something, to herself, to the ghost of her father, and to the man waiting for her in the valley. He didn't know if it was worth it, but he hoped for her sake that it was. Reese had no answer for him. The truth was, she didn't know if it was worth it either. She just knew that there was no other path left for her to walk. They sat in silence until Haynes finally stood up, his joints popping, and walked back inside without another word. The morning of the third day arrived with a brutal, unforgiving speed. Reese woke before the sun had even begun to gray the horizon. She dressed in a rhythmic silence, the familiar weight of her gear providing a small measure of comfort. She checked the Barrett one last time, the bolt sliding home with a metallic clack that sounded like a closing door. Her vest was heavy with extra magazines, water, and a medical kit she hoped she wouldn't need. She packed everything necessary for a fight, but as she looked around her sparse room, she realized she hadn't packed a single thing that would help her if she needed to get out alive. Morris was waiting for her at the armory, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He offered her one last chance to change her mind, a final exit ramp before she crossed the point of no return. Reese didn't hesitate. She told him she was going. He nodded as if he had expected nothing else and handed her a small, encrypted radio. He explained that Haynes would be positioned on an overwatch ridge 2 kilometers out. He would have eyes on the entire valley. If Volkov tried to pull a stunt or bring in reinforcements, Haynes would call it in, and the cavalry would move in immediately. Reese asked the question that had been haunting her. What if Volkov took out Haynes first? Morris's expression darkened, the lines around his eyes deepening. He told her that if that happened, she'd better not miss. The helicopter ride was a short, turbulent journey over jagged peaks and dry riverbeds. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, they reached the edge of the valley. The bird hovered just long enough for Reese to jump out, her gear rattling as she hit the dusty ground. She watched as the helicopter lifted off, banking sharply and disappearing over the ridge, the sound of its rotors fading until there was nothing left but the wind. Then, she was alone. The silence of the valley was absolute, a heavy physical presence that seemed to press against her eardrums. It was just her, the rifle, and the 3-kilometer walk into the heart of the trap. The terrain was exactly as Volkov had described, and exactly what a sniper would choose for a final stand. It was a wide, open expanse of cracked earth dotted with jagged rocks and low-lying scrub brush. The ground stretched out for miles before rising sharply into steep, inaccessible cliffs on the far side. It was a perfect killing ground, offering almost no natural cover for anyone moving across the center. Reese moved with agonizing slowness, staying low to the ground and using every dip in the terrain to mask her silhouette. Her eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, looking for the telltale glint of glass or the unnatural shape of a ghillie suit. Her radio crackled with a burst of static, and then Haynes's voice came through. He confirmed he was in position and had her in his sights, but there was still no sign of Volkov. Reese whispered back that he was there. She could feel him. It was a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of a predator watching from the shadows. She kept moving, counting her steps to maintain her pace and constantly recalculating the distance to the cliffs. When she reached the approximate center of the valley, she found the marker. It was a flat, gray stone, roughly 3 feet across, sitting in the open like a sacrificial altar. And there, resting in the center of the stone, was a single playing card, the Ace of Spades. The wind fluttered the edges of the card, but it remained pinned down by a small pebble. Reese reached out and picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. On the back, written in a neat, flowing script that looked like it belonged in a ledger, were the words, 1500 m due north when you are ready. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned slowly to the north, shielding her eyes from the rising sun, and began to scan the distant cliffs through her handheld optics. At first, there was nothing but the red-brown of the rock and the dancing waves of heat distortion. Then, at the very edge of the ridge, she saw it, a tiny, needle-like glint of metal. A rifle barrel. Volkov wasn't hiding. He was sitting right where he said he would be, out in the open, waiting for her to acknowledge him. Haynes's voice crackled in her ear again, urgent and sharp. He had spotted him too, 1,500 meters dead north. He confirmed that the target was exposed and wasn't making any move to conceal himself. Reese replied quietly that she knew. She moved to a low rise a few yards away, a small mound of earth that offered a modicum of stability. She deployed the bipod of the Barrett, settled the stock into the hollow of her shoulder, and merged her world with the view through the scope. The high magnification optics brought Volkov into startlingly clear focus. He was sitting on a jagged rock, his own rifle resting casually across his knees. He wasn't wearing a mask or a hood. His face was lined and weathered, his hair a shock of silver against the dark stone. He was looking through his own scope, staring directly down the line of her barrel. He was waiting for her to make the first move, to prove that she was the daughter of the man who had taught him everything. Reese's finger settled onto the cold curve of the trigger. The wind was a gentle, consistent cross breeze from the west, easily compensated for. The distance was well within the Barrett's effective range. The target was stationary. All she had to do was apply 3 pounds of pressure, and the .50 caliber round would bridge the gap in less than 2 seconds, ending the threat of Volkov forever. It was the simplest shot she had ever been asked to take. But as she began the slow, rhythmic breathing of a marksman, a memory bubbled up from the depths of her mind, unbidden and vivid. She saw her father sitting on the porch of their old house, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand, and the weight of the world in his eyes. He had been in a philosophical mood that night, his voice thick with a sadness she hadn't understood at the time. He had told her that the hardest shot she would ever take wouldn't be at 1,000 meters or in the middle of a hurricane. It would be the shot she chose not to take. He told her that the decision to withhold fire was the one that truly defined who a person was. Reese's hands began to tremble. She forced herself to exhale slowly, fighting to steady the crosshairs that were currently dancing over Volkov's chest. The man on the cliff hadn't moved. He hadn't even reached for his bolt. He was simply sitting there, a silent challenge in human form, daring her to pull the trigger. And then her radio crackled again, but the voice that came through wasn't Haynes's. It was the smooth, melodic accent of Volkov. He told her she was thinking too much, calling her little one. He mused that Eli would be disappointed in her hesitation. Reese keyed her mic, her voice tight with tension, and asked how he had accessed their encrypted frequency. Volkov chuckled, a sound that was devoid of any real mirth. He reminded her that he had been doing this for a very long time, longer than she had been alive. He spoke of her father again, acknowledging the lessons of patience and discipline. But he claimed there was one lesson Eli could never quite make him understand. Reese felt a chill run down her spine as the word mercy hung in the air between them, transmitted across the empty valley. Volkov explained that Eli had tried many times to teach him the value of it, but he had always viewed mercy as a fatal weakness. He believed that hesitation was a death sentence in their line of work, and for decades he had been right. He had survived because he never hesitated, because he took every shot that presented itself. Reese's finger tightened on the trigger until she was at the very edge of the break. She asked him why he was hesitating now. Volkov's response was a dry, hollow sound, a laugh that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. He admitted that he was old and tired, and that in his waning years he had begun to wonder if Eli had been right all along. Reese called him a liar, her voice cracking with the strain of the standoff. Volkov didn't argue. He simply told her to pull the trigger and prove him wrong. The urge to do it was almost overwhelming. It was a physical ache in her chest, a desire to end the fear, to avenge the men he had killed, and to finally step out from the long shadow of her father's legacy. But something in Volkov's voice held her back. It wasn't fear. It was a profound, soul-deep weariness. He sounded like a man who had reached the end of a very long road and had simply decided to sit down. She reminded him through the radio that he had killed 3 of their snipers, good men who were just doing their jobs. She demanded to know why. Volkov's answer was chillingly logical. He killed them because they came for him. That was the nature of the game. Soldiers follow orders, he said. They don't ask questions. He claimed her father understood the brutal reality that every man he trained would eventually point a rifle at another human being. He asked Reese if she could carry that same burden. Reese felt the breath hitch in her throat. She asked what he was talking about. Volkov spoke of the weight of the shot, the realization that pulling the trigger wasn't just about ending a life, but about playing God and deciding which life held more value. He said that weight had eventually broken her father, and it would break her too if she let it. Reese's vision blurred as hot tears pricked at her eyes. She shouted into the mic that he didn't know anything about her father. Volkov countered by saying he knew Eli died alone. He knew her father had spent his final years teaching others the art of killing while desperately trying to convince himself it was for some greater good. And he knew Eli had loved her more than anything, enough to try to keep her as far away from this life as possible. Yet there she was, lying in the dirt with a high-powered rifle, proving that the cycle never truly ends. Reese blinked hard, forcing her focus back to the scope. She accused him of trying to get inside her head, of trying to distract her. Volkov denied it. He said he was trying to show her the same truth Eli had failed to impart to him, that the mechanical act of shooting was the easy part. The hard part was the lifetime spent living with what you had done. Haynes's voice suddenly cut through the radio, sharp and panicked. He was screaming at her to take the shot, telling her that Volkov was an operative, a target, a monster. But Reese couldn't do it. The crosshairs were steady now, centered perfectly on Volkov's heart, but the connection between her brain and her finger had severed. She asked Volkov what he really wanted. He told her he wanted her to make a choice, the same choice her father had made every single day of his life, to shoot or not to shoot, to be a killer or to show mercy. He told her that choice was the only thing that separated them from the animals they hunted. Reese stared through the scope, her heart rate slowing until she could hear the rhythmic thumping in her ears. One squeeze. That was all it would take to fulfill her mission, to be the hero Morris wanted and the soldier the agency needed. But then she thought about Briggs, the sniper she had watched bleed out on a dusty rooftop, and how he had looked at her with a trust she hadn't felt she deserved. She thought about her father sitting on that porch, his shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of 1,000 ghosts. She realized that Volkov was right. This wasn't a test of her marksmanship. It was a test of her humanity. Slowly, with a deliberate motion that felt like she was shedding a heavy skin, Reese lifted her finger off the trigger. She moved her hand away from the rifle and slowly stood up. She stood tall on the small rise, her silhouette stark against the vast, empty valley. She faced Volkov across the 1,500 meters of dead space, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. Haynes was still screaming in her ear, his voice a frantic blur of orders and pleas. He told her to get down, to take cover, to do anything other than stand there like a target. She ignored him, her gaze locked on the distant cliff where Volkov sat. She waited, the wind whipping her hair across her face, her heart remarkably still. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Volkov stood up. He moved with a slow, stiff grace, shouldering his rifle in one fluid motion. He didn't run and he didn't wave. He brought the rifle to his shoulder and aimed it directly at her. Time slowed to a crawl. Reese could see the glint of his lens. She knew that at this distance, for a man of his skill, she was a trivial target. He wouldn't miss. She could almost feel the phantom impact of the bullet against her chest. Haynes was still yelling, but his voice sounded like it was coming from miles away, drowned out by the roar of the blood in her ears. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, locked into the earth. She couldn't move, and she realized she didn't want to. This was the moment her father had warned her about, the moment when your life is no longer in your hands, but in the hands of the person you are looking at through the glass. Volkov's voice came through the radio one last time, soft and contemplative. He asked if she knew what her father had said to him the last time they spoke. Reese's throat was too dry to answer. Volkov didn't wait for a response. He told her Eli had said that a rifle doesn't make a person powerful, it makes them responsible. He admitted that back then he had thought Eli was being sentimental and weak. He hadn't understood. Volkov paused, and Reese could see his finger tighten on his own trigger. He told her that standing there now, looking at her through his scope, he finally understood exactly what Eli meant. The radio went silent. Reese watched through the shimmering heat as Volkov prepared to fire. She thought about diving for the dirt, about reaching for her Barrett, about the dozen different ways she could try to survive the next few seconds. But she stayed perfectly still. She realized that if she moved now, she would be proving him right. She would be admitting that fear was the only thing that mattered, and that the lessons of her father were nothing more than beautiful lies. She stood her ground, an act of faith that felt more dangerous than any firefight she had ever been in. The shot never came. Instead of the crack of a rifle, there was only the sound of the wind. Through the shimmer of the valley, Reese saw Volkov slowly, deliberately lower his weapon. He stood there for a moment, a solitary figure on the edge of the world. And then he nodded. It was a single, sharp movement of his head, a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of a debt paid, or perhaps just a final goodbye to the ghost of the man who had tried to save him. Reese's knees finally gave way. She collapsed onto a nearby rock, her breath coming in ragged, gasping sobs as the adrenaline began to drain from her system. She looked back toward the cliff, but Volkov was already gone, disappearing into the shadows of the rocks as if he had never been there at all. She was alone in the valley, but for the first time in her life, the weight of her father's rifle didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a choice. Reese Callahan stood in the thin, biting air of the mountain pass, her lungs burning as she fought to pull in oxygen. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the high-stakes game of cat and mouse with Yuri Volkov was now a receding tide, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a tremor in her hands she couldn't quite suppress. Across the rocky expanse, the legendary sniper's voice remained a haunting presence over the radio, calm and devoid of the jagged edge of combat. It was the voice of a man who had seen the end of the world and decided to keep walking. Haynes was still shouting in her ear, his voice a frantic blur of profanity and sheer, unadulterated relief. He was miles away, watching through a remote lens, his heart rate likely mirroring hers, but he wasn't the one standing in the kill zone. Volkov's voice cut through Haynes's chatter, quieter now, almost intimate. He told her she had passed the test, calling her little one in a way that felt less like an insult and more like a grim acknowledgement of her lineage. But the lesson, he insisted, was not finished. Reese managed to choke out a question, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. What lesson could possibly be left after staring down the barrel of the world's most dangerous rifle? Volkov's response was immediate and cold. He told her that mercy must be earned, not simply given. It was a philosophy forged in the blood-soaked soil of a dozen forgotten wars, a truth he had lived by while the rest of the world played at morality. Before she could wrap her mind around the implications of his words, the tone of his voice shifted. The teacher was gone, replaced by the veteran operator. He warned her. Men were coming, his former employers. They were the kind of men who viewed a change of heart as a terminal offense. Volkov had been reconsidering his career choices, as he put it with a dark, dry wit, and the people who paid his contracts did not appreciate the ambiguity of his current status. They would be there in less than an hour, and they would not be bringing the mercy he had shown her. Reese felt her head snap up, her eyes scanning the horizon even as her body screamed for rest. She asked how many were coming. Volkov's estimate was grim, 8, maybe 10. He described them as good, not as good as him, but proficient enough to end her life if she allowed her focus to slip for even a second. The confusion flared in her chest. Why was he telling her this? Why give her a head start or a warning at all? The answer went back decades, to a time before Reese was even a thought. Her father had once saved Volkov's life when he had no reason to do so. It was a moment of unscripted humanity in a world of rigid orders. Volkov had carried that debt for 30 years, a weight on his soul that he was finally ready to set down. This warning, this chance at survival, was the final payment. The radio crackled, the signal degrading into a wash of white noise and static. Volkov gave her a final direction. There was a cave system 300 meters to the east of her current position. He told her to go there, to wait, and to remember what her father, Eli, had taught her about the virtue of patience. Then the line went dead. Reese clutched her radio, calling out Volkov's name into the void, but there was no response. The ghost had vanished back into the mountain mists. Haynes broke through the silence, his voice tight and breathless. He had movement on the western ridge, multiple contacts, heavily armed, moving with tactical precision. They weren't hiding their presence, they were a hunting party, and they were closing the distance fast. He urged her to move, his voice rising in an octave of suppressed panic. Reese didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy Barrett, the cold steel of the rifle a familiar weight against her shoulder, slung her pack, and began to run. Every step was a battle. Her ankle, twisted earlier in the pursuit, screamed in protest with every impact against the uneven ground. The mountain air seemed to thin even further, making her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She found the cave system Volkov had mentioned, a dark, jagged slash in the side of the rocky hill. It looked like a wound in the earth, leading down into a cool, oppressive darkness. She ducked inside, the temperature dropping instantly, the smell of damp stone and ancient dust filling her nose. She pushed deep into the shadows, moving far enough that the glare of the sun wouldn't catch the lens of her scope or the pale skin of her face. She found a shelf of rock that offered a commanding view of the valley entrance. It was a perfect sniper's nest, providing both concealment and a clear line of fire. She set up the Barrett, the bipod legs clicking into place with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the stillness of the cave. She checked her ammunition. The count was low, dangerously low. She slowed her breathing, forcing her heart rate down, entering the meditative state her father had mastered. She waited. Haynes's voice was a constant, tense whisper in her ear. He tracked the hunters as they spread out, moving through the rocks with the confidence of professionals. They were searching for someone, likely Volkov, but Reese knew that if they found her first, they wouldn't stop to ask questions. She asked about backup, her voice a low murmur. The response wasn't encouraging. 20 minutes, maybe 30, before the extraction team could reach her position. She looked at her remaining rounds, 6 in the rifle, 3 spare magazines. The math was a nightmare. 8 to 10 trained killers against 1 exhausted sniper with a handful of bullets. She told Haynes she would manage, though the lie tasted like copper in her mouth. The first target emerged 5 minutes later. He was a shadow among shadows, dressed in high-end tactical gear, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the field. He used the terrain well, hugging the base of boulders and checking his corners with mechanical efficiency. He was a professional, a man who understood the geometry of a gunfight. But even professionals can be undone by a moment of hubris. He stopped in a small clearing to scan the ridgeline, his silhouette momentarily stark against the gray stone. Reese didn't think, she reacted. The Barrett's roar was a physical force, a thunderclap that shook the walls of the cave and sent a cloud of dust raining down from the ceiling. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, a familiar, bruising kiss. Through the scope, she saw the man drop instantly, the massive caliber of the round making armor irrelevant. The valley, which had been silent a moment before, erupted into chaos. The remaining hunters scattered, diving for cover as the echoes of the shot rolled across the peaks like a summer storm. She had lost the element of surprise, but she had evened the odds, if only slightly. 7 left, maybe fewer if her shot had been as true as it felt. Haynes's voice came through, noting the kill but warning her that the hunters now had a fix on her position. Reese knew it. She didn't stay to admire her work. She grabbed the rifle and retreated deeper into the cave's labyrinthine throat, finding a secondary position that offered a different angle on the entrance. The hunters changed their approach. They became cautious, moving in short, disciplined rushes, leapfrogging each other to maintain suppressive fire. They were trying to flank her, to pin her down in the darkness and force her to burn through her precious ammunition on low-probability shots. But Reese had been raised by Eli Callahan. She knew the value of the shot not taken. She watched them, her eye pressed to the glass, waiting for the one who would get impatient. It happened when one of them attempted to sprint between two large rocks, a distance of maybe 15 feet. It was a fast move, but Reese was faster. She anticipated the break, lead the target by a hair's breadth, and squeezed the trigger. Another roar, another body falling limp into the dirt. 6 left. The silence that followed was broken by a new voice on the radio. It wasn't Haynes or Volkov. It was a hard, clipped voice speaking English with a heavy, unidentifiable accent. The man told her she was making a mistake. He claimed they weren't there for her. He offered a deal, give them Volkov and she could walk away with her life. Reese remained silent. She knew the game. They were trying to locate her by her voice, trying to gauge her resolve. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a response. The voice tried again, more insistent this time. They knew she was American military. They knew she was alone, and they knew she couldn't hold the cave forever. They urged her to be smart, to tell them where Volkov had gone so the killing could end. Reese felt a grim smile touch her lips. They thought she was protecting him. They thought she was a loyal soldier standing guard over a valuable asset. The truth was far more complicated. She had no idea where the Russian had gone, and even if she did, the idea of handing him over to these butchers felt like a betrayal of the mercy he had shown her. She didn't forget debts, a trait she had inherited from a father who had saved a man he was supposed to kill. Haynes's voice cut through the psychological warfare. 2 hunters were moving up on her left flank, 50 meters, and closing fast. She shifted her position, the heavy rifle scraping softly against the stone. She brought the barrel around, the weight of the Barrett a burden she felt in her very bones. Patience, she told herself. Patience wins fights. Panic is the real killer. The first man appeared at the mouth of the cave, his silhouette a jagged black shape against the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. He was smart. He didn't rush in. He fired a disciplined burst of automatic fire into the darkness, the muzzle flashes illuminating the cave walls in brief, strobing bursts. The bullets sparked off the stone inches from Reese's head, showering her in grit. Simultaneously, his partner appeared on the ridge above, trying to find a downward angle into her sanctuary. Reese was forced to make a split-second choice. She ignored the man at the entrance, trusting the shadows to hide her, and focused on the threat from above. The man on the ridge was exposed, confident in his high ground. He was a silhouette against the sky, a perfect target. She fired, and he vanished from the skyline. Before his partner at the entrance could process the loss, she shifted her aim and sent a round through the cave mouth. She didn't hit him, but the sheer power of the shot forced him to dive for cover, giving her a moment to breathe. 4 left. Her ammunition was a haunting thought in the back of her mind. 2 rounds in the rifle, 1 spare magazine. She was down to the wire. Haynes updated her on the backup, 10 minutes out. In a high-intensity firefight, 10 minutes was an eternity. It was a lifetime. The hunters knew she was running dry. Their movements became more aggressive, their fire more continuous. They were suppressed, but they were advancing, using the weight of their numbers to close the noose. Then came the sound that made her blood run cold, the distinctive, hollow thump of a grenade launcher. Haynes's warning was a scream in her ear, but the projectile was already in the air. Reese threw herself backward, rolling behind a thick pillar of limestone as the grenade detonated at the cave's entrance. The explosion was deafening, a wall of heat and pressure that threw her against the cold stone. Dust and acrid smoke filled the air, choking her, blinding her. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. She lay there for a second, stunned, the taste of dirt and iron in her mouth. She was alive, but only just. Through the haze of smoke, she heard the crunch of boots on stone. They were inside. She heard their voices, low and urgent, speaking in clipped Russian. They were close, 10 feet, maybe less. She had 1 round left in the Barrett, a weapon too long and heavy for the close-quarters fight she was now in. Reese let the rifle fall. It was useless now. She drew her sidearm, her grip slick with sweat and dust. The first hunter rounded the corner, his rifle sweeping the shadows. She didn't wait for him to find her. She fired 2 shots into his center mass. He went down with a wet grunt, but his partner was right behind him. The second man opened fire immediately, bullets chewing into the stone pillar Reese was using for cover. She rolled to her right, her movements a blur of desperation. She came up and in a final act of defiance, grabbed the Barrett by the grip, leveled it from the hip and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly wrenched her arm from its socket, the muzzle flash a blinding white light in the dark cave. The hunter's chest disintegrated under the impact of the .50 caliber round. He was thrown backward as if struck by a speeding vehicle. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Reese dropped the massive rifle, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She drew her knife, the blade a cold, sharp promise in the dark. She was out of bullets, out of options, and out of time. If they wanted her, they were going to have to bleed for every inch of the cave. She braced herself for the final rush, but the rush never came. From outside, the silence was shattered by a new chorus of gunfire, not aimed at the cave, but coming from the heights above it. She heard shouting, voices filled with a sudden, sharp terror. Reese risked a glance toward the entrance, peering through the settling dust. The two remaining hunters were pinned down in the open, firing frantically at the ridge where a lone figure had appeared. It was Volkov. He was a wraith on the skyline, moving with a predatory grace that made the professional hunters look like amateurs. He was picking them apart with a surgical precision that was terrifying to behold. One shot, one kill. He didn't stay in one place. He fired, moved, and reappeared a dozen yards away before the hunters could even track his muzzle flash. They were caught in a lethal crossfire between the ghost on the mountain and the woman in the cave. Their discipline shattered. They tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. In a matter of seconds, it was over. The last of the hunters fell, their bodies becoming part of the mountain's grim history. The valley returned to a haunting, unnatural silence. Reese stumbled out of the cave, her knife still clenched in her hand, her eyes darting between the bodies. She half expected another ambush, another test, but the only movement was the drifting smoke from the rifle barrels. Volkov's voice came through the radio one last time. It was the same calm, weathered tone she had heard before. He told her she had fought well, and that her father would be proud of the woman she had become. Reese called out to him, asking where he was, her voice cracking with the strain of the day. Volkov's reply was simple. He was leaving. This valley, this country, none of it was safe anymore. But before he vanished, he had one final gift for her. He told her of a camp 40 kilometers to the north. It was a training facility for insurgent snipers, the place where the next generation of killers was being forged. He told her the coordinates were in her pocket, on the playing card he had left her. Reese reached into her tactical vest, her fingers brushing against the stiff card. She pulled out the ace of spades. Beneath the message Volkov had written earlier were a series of small, precisely lettered numbers, GPS coordinates. She asked him why. Why give her this? Why help the very military that had been hunting him for years? Volkov's voice softened, losing its metallic edge. He said he was tired of training men to kill, tired of the endless cycle of blood. He believed that Reese now understood the lesson he had spent a lifetime learning, that the greatest power a warrior possesses is not the ability to take a life, but the choice not to. He said goodbye, expressing a hope that if they ever met again, it wouldn't be through the lens of a rifle scope. Then the radio went dead for good. Reese stood there, the ace of spades clutched in her hand, staring at the numbers. A training facility. Volkov hadn't just been a lone wolf. He had been the architect of a shadow war, and now he was handing her the keys to tear it down. It was a chance to stop the killing before it started, to save the lives of soldiers who would never even know her name. The distant, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors began to vibrate in the air. The extraction team was close. Haynes would arrive with 1,000 questions, and Morris would arrive with 1,000 more. Somewhere in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the mountains, Yuri Volkov was disappearing, a man who carried the weight of 100 kills and a single, profound act of mercy. Reese looked down at the bodies of the 8 men who had come to kill him. They were strangers, men she had never met, whose lives she had ended in a dark hole in the side of a mountain. She expected to feel something, the rush of victory, the weight of guilt, perhaps even a flicker of anger. But all she felt was a profound, soul-deep tiredness. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only the cold and the quiet. Haynes found her 20 minutes later. He came over the ridge with a squad of soldiers, their weapons high and tight, their eyes scanning for threats that were no longer there. He found Reese sitting on a weathered rock outside the cave entrance, the empty Barrett lying across her knees like a dead weight. Haynes took one look at the carnage in the valley, the bodies, the scorched earth from the grenade, and let out a long, low whistle. He told her the backup had arrived and that Morris was already demanding a full debrief. Reese just nodded, her eyes fixed on the distant peaks. Haynes sat down on the rock next to her, his shoulder brushing hers. He asked her if she was okay. She was honest with him, she said no. But she followed it with a promise she would be. Haynes accepted that, knowing the cost of the ground they stood on. He asked about Volkov. Gone, Reese said, her voice steady. You let him go. Haynes noted. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation of a fact he already knew. Reese met his eyes, her gaze clear and unwavering. She told him that Volkov had given her something far more valuable than a body count. He had given her a target that would save lives, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Haynes considered this for a moment, looking out over the valley where the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the stone. He stood up and offered her a hand. He told her it was time to get out of there before Morris had a stroke from the anticipation. She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Her ankle throbbed, and her body felt as though it were made of lead, but she walked toward the waiting helicopter. She felt the weight of the ace of spades in her pocket, a small piece of paper that held the power to change the course of the local war. It was a chance to finish what her father had started all those years ago in a different mountain range, under a different sky. It was proof that mercy wasn't a weakness or a lapse in judgment. It was the hardest choice a soldier could make, and the only one that truly mattered. The debriefing tent was a sterile, brightly lit island in the middle of the dark base camp. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, canvas, and the hum of electronics. Colonel Morris sat across from Reese, his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't yell, which was the first sign that he was truly furious or truly concerned. He stared at her as if she were a complicated piece of machinery that had suddenly malfunctioned. "You let him walk," Morris said, his voice a low rumble. Reese didn't blink. She told him she had acquired intelligence that would save American lives, and that in her estimation, that was the ultimate goal of the mission. Morris countered that the mission was specifically to eliminate Volkov, the primary threat. Reese stood her ground. She argued that the threat had been neutralized, and that by sparing him, she had gained something much larger. She slid the ace of spades across the scarred plastic of the table. She explained what the coordinates represented, the sniper training facility that had been the source of so much grief for coalition forces over the past 6 months. She told him that taking out that camp would do more to stabilize the region than Volkov's death ever could. Morris picked up the card, his eyes narrowing as he studied the numbers. He looked like a man trying to decide whether to give her a medal or a court-martial. He asked if she was sure it wasn't a trap. Reese pointed out that Volkov had held her life in his hands twice and had chosen not to take it. If he wanted her dead, she wouldn't be sitting in that tent. The intel was real, she insisted, because Volkov wanted that part of his life to end as much as they did. Haynes, standing in the shadows at the back of the tent, cleared his throat. He backed her up, telling the colonel that he had seen the entire engagement. Volkov had the shot and passed it up, then returned to save Reese when the hunters closed in. Whatever the Russians' motivations were, Haynes argued, he clearly wanted the training camp shut down. Morris set the card back on the table. He asked what could possibly change a man like Volkov, a man who had spent decades as a professional instrument of death. Reese thought of her father, of the stories he hadn't told, and the weight he had carried until his final day. She suggested that perhaps Volkov had simply grown tired of carrying the bodies. Morris wasn't a man given to sentiment, and he didn't look convinced, but he was a pragmatist. He told her he would forward the coordinates to command. If they checked out, the facility would be hit within 48 hours. But he warned her that the conversation wasn't over. He reminded her that she had made a field decision with massive political and strategic implications. If Volkov resurfaced and more soldiers died, the blood would be on her hands. Reese told him she understood. She left the tent and stepped out into the cool night air of the base. She knew Morris was right. She had gambled everything on the word of a killer, betting that mercy could be a currency of its own. If she was wrong, the cost would be measured in the lives of good men and women. The weight of that responsibility settled onto her shoulders, a permanent addition to the gear she carried. Haynes caught up with her as she walked toward the barracks. He told her she had made the right call. Reese admitted she didn't know that for sure, and Haynes pointed out that no one ever did. The only thing that mattered was that she had the courage to make the call in the first place. As she lay in her bunk that night, the sound of the base humming around her, Reese thought about the long line of snipers that stretched back through history. Her father, Volkov, and now her. They were people who lived in the spaces between heartbeats, who saw the world through a glass lens. It was a lonely life, defined by the things they took away. But for the first time, she felt like she had finally given something back. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, the shadows behind her eyelids didn't feel like a threat. They felt like a beginning. The following morning, the base was a hive of activity. The coordinates had been verified by satellite reconnaissance. The training camp was there, exactly where Volkov said it would be, hidden in a deep canyon that had evaded previous scans. Strike teams were being briefed, and the air was thick with the scent of jet fuel and the anticipation of a major operation. Reese watched from the perimeter, a cup of bitter coffee in her hand. She wasn't part of the strike. She had done her job. She thought about the men in that camp, the ones Volkov had trained. They were the ones who would pay the price for his change of heart. It was a brutal irony, but one she could live with. She looked toward the mountains, the peaks still capped in white, standing silent and indifferent to the affairs of men. Somewhere out there, Volkov was moving through the high passes, a ghost returning to the mist. She wondered if he was finally at peace, or if a man like him could ever truly find it. As the first wave of strike aircraft roared overhead, their engines shaking the ground, Reese felt a strange sense of closure. The ace of spades was gone, tucked away in an intelligence file, but the lesson it represented remained. Mercy wasn't about being soft, it was about being strong enough to see the bigger picture. It was the hardest shot she had ever taken, and she hadn't even had to pull the trigger. The air in the staging area was thick with the scent of unwashed fatigue and the metallic tang of machinery, a scent that seemed to cling to the back of Reese Callahan's throat. Across from her, Haynes pulled out a cigarette, the white paper stark against his grime-streaked fingers. He stared at it for a long, contemplative second, his thumb hovering over the wheel of his lighter before the reality of their surroundings, an enclosed space filled with high-grade explosives and sensitive electronics, seemed to register. With a quiet, frustrated sigh, he tucked the cigarette back into his pocket. He looked at Reese, his eyes weary but sharp. He told her that Morris was sending a team to recon those coordinates. If there was a facility there, if their ghost had finally left a footprint, they would know within 12 hours. 12 hours. It sounded like a lifetime when measured in heartbeats and the slow, rhythmic ticking of a clock on a cinder block wall. It was 12 hours to find out if she had truly saved lives by letting Volkov walk, or if she had simply thrown them away in a moment of misplaced sentimentality. The uncertainty was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. To escape the suffocating silence of the barracks, Reese retreated to the armory. It was her sanctuary, a place of cold steel and the honest smell of solvent. She spent those hours meticulously cleaning her Barrett. 50 cal. It didn't need cleaning. She had stripped it and oiled it twice since their last engagement, but the repetitive, mechanical motion served as a tether to reality. Her hands moved with a practiced grace, sliding the cleaning rod through the massive barrel, wiping down the bolt carrier group until the metal shone like dark glass. The rhythm of the work gave her hands something to do while her mind, restless and predatory, chewed on everything that had transpired in that dusty valley. Volkov's voice, low and resonant with a strange kind of wisdom, kept echoing in the hollows of her skull. He had told her that the rifle does not make one powerful, it makes one responsible. The words felt like a brand. They were hauntingly familiar, a distorted mirror of something her father had once told her. She allowed herself to drift back to when she was 16. She remembered the heat of a Georgia summer, the air so humid it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. She had been angry then, a searing, directionless rage directed at a world that felt too small and a father who felt too large. Eli Callahan had tried to guide her, to shape her, and she had resisted him at every turn, viewing his discipline as a cage. He had taken her to a private range tucked deep in the woods, the scent of pine needles and spent gunpowder hanging heavy in the clearing. He had handed her his personal bolt-action rifle, a heavy, venerable piece of machinery that felt like a lead weight in her teenage hands. He had told her to shoot, but she had refused. She remembered the way she had glared at him, her jaw set in a stubborn line. She told him she didn't want any part of his world, that she wasn't going to become just another soldier who defined their worth by how efficiently they could take a life. She wanted to be anything else, something that didn't involve the dark mathematics of ballistics and windage. Her father hadn't gotten angry. Instead, he had smiled, a sad, knowing expression that reached his eyes but didn't quite light them up. He told her that her reluctance was exactly why she would be good at it. He said she would be better than the rest because she understood the weight of the act. At 16, she hadn't understood a thing. She thought he was just being cryptic, playing the part of the grizzled warrior. But now, sitting in a dimly lit armory half a world away, the weight he had spoken of felt heavy enough to crush her ribs. The meditative silence was shattered by the sharp, electric crackle of the radio on the workbench. Haynes's voice came through, urgent and stripped of its usual casual cadence. He told her to get to the command tent immediately. Reese didn't hesitate. She dropped the cleaning rod, the metal clattering against the concrete floor, and ran. The night air was biting, a sharp contrast to the stale warmth of the armory, but she barely felt it. Inside the command tent, the atmosphere was electric with the hum of high-end processors and the low murmur of analysts. Morris was hunched over a ruggedized laptop, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glow of satellite imagery pulled up on the screen. Haynes stood beside him, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression grim and unreadable. When Reese entered, the two men looked up. Morris wasted no time on pleasantries. He told her that her intel was good, better than good. Drone footage had confirmed a training facility at the exact coordinates she had provided. It wasn't just a camp, it was a sophisticated compound. Multiple structures, a significant weapons cache, and approximately 30 to 40 individuals on site. Morris leaned forward, his finger tapping the screen as he zoomed in on a high-resolution thermal image. He pointed to a specific area of the compound, a long-distance shooting range equipped with sophisticated targets and training apparatus. Standing in the center of the range, surrounded by a group of individuals who appeared to be students, was a figure Reese recognized instantly. Even from a grainy overhead shot, there was no mistaking the silhouette. The man was tall and lean, carrying himself with a terrifying, easy confidence that suggested he had spent his entire life in environments just like this. Volkov. Morris confirmed it. He was still there, standing out in the open as if he had no fear of the eyes in the sky. Reese felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It didn't make sense. A man with Volkov's experience, a man who had survived decades in the shadows of the world's most brutal conflicts, wouldn't just sit and wait to be found. He knew how the American military machine worked. He knew that the moment his location was breathed into a radio, the clock started ticking toward his destruction. Why would he give up his own location? Why stay in a place he knew was compromised? Morris straightened his back, his face a mask of command. He didn't have the answers, but he made it clear that command wanted them, and they wanted them now. He informed her that they were hitting the facility in 6 hours. It was a full strike package, fast movers for air support, a ground assault team, the works. Then he looked her directly in the eye and told her she was coming with them. Reese blinked, momentarily stunned. She pointed out that she wasn't cleared for a direct action mission of this scale. She was a specialist, an asset, not a frontline door kicker for a Delta-level operation. Morris's voice hardened, his tone brooking no argument. He told her that she was the only person who had actually spoken to Volkov, the only one who might have a sliver of leverage. She was their best chance at getting him to surrender without turning the entire compound into a slaughterhouse. This was her chance, he said, to finish what she had started. He asked her point-blank if she was in or out. For a heartbeat, Reese considered saying no. She thought about walking away from the madness, returning to the armory, and letting the professionals handle the carnage. But she knew she couldn't. She had been the one to let him go. She had been the one to trust his cryptic promise. She had made this mess, and her father's voice whispered in her mind, reminding her that a Callahan always cleaned up their own messes. She looked at Morris and told him she was in. The preparation for the assault was a blur of controlled chaos. The assault team began loading into the heavy transport helicopters just after midnight. The darkness of the airfield punctuated only by the dim red glow of tactical lights. Reese found herself squeezed into a jump seat between Haynes and a Delta operator whose face was a map of scars, and whose eyes looked like they had seen the end of the world and found it boring. The man looked like he ate nails for breakfast and washed them down with jet fuel. Nobody talked. The interior of the helicopter was a chamber of vibrating metal and focused tension. The only sounds were the rhythmic, soul-shaking thump of the rotors and the occasional, static-heavy crackle of the radio. Through her headset, Morris's voice came through, sounding distant and clinical. He laid out the rules of engagement with chilling simplicity. Anyone who surrendered was to be detained. Anyone who showed a weapon or offered resistance was to be put down. But Volkov was the priority. They needed him alive, if at all possible. The operator next to Reese let out a short, cynical snort that was audible even over the engine noise. He wished them good luck with that. In his world, men like Volkov didn't come along quietly. As the helicopters banked over the final ridgeline, The facility appeared below them. In the vast, ink-black darkness of the desert, it looked like a small, lonely cluster of lights. The pilots circled the compound once, a predatory bird marking its prey, and then the command was given. The doors slid open, and a rush of frigid mountain air flooded the cabin. Reese felt the familiar jolt of adrenaline as she gripped the thick rope. She fast-roped down, hitting the ground hard, her boots kicking up a cloud of fine dust. She was up in a second, her rifle held at the ready, moving in perfect synchronization with the team as they breached the perimeter. They moved like ghosts, a fluid line of shadows and suppressed weapons. They breached the first building with surgical precision, flashbangs, filtered light, and the rapid sweep of muzzles. Empty. They moved to the second, then the third, their movements growing more urgent as the realization set in. There was no resistance. No sentries, no panicked shouts, no return fire. Where is everyone? Haynes whispered into his comms, his voice tight with suspicion. The answer came 30 seconds later. Suddenly, the entire compound was flooded with light. High-intensity floodlights mounted on the perimeter poles roared to life, blinding the team for a fraction of a second until their night vision goggles auto-adjusted. Then a voice boomed over a loudspeaker system, the sound echoing off the surrounding hills. It was a voice Reese knew well, low, calm, and impossibly steady. Volkov. He welcomed her. He told her quite simply that he had been expecting her. The assault team froze, a dozen rifles swinging instantly toward the source of the sound, but there was no target to lock onto. There was only the voice, disembodied and haunting, echoing across the empty gravel of the compound. Volkov continued, his tone almost conversational. He told them he knew what they were thinking, that it was a trap, an ambush, a final act of defiance. But he told them they were wrong. He called it a gift. In Reese's ear, Morris's voice crackled with a mix of frustration and confusion. He demanded to know what Volkov was talking about. Reese didn't answer. She couldn't find the words because the pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place in her mind. She looked around the brilliantly lit, silent compound and felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Volkov's voice filled the space again. He spoke of his life, 30 years spent teaching men how to kill with clinical precision. He said he was tired. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. He explained that he had made a decision. He had given his students a choice, surrender and live or fight and die. He told them that most had chosen surrender and that they were currently restrained in Building 4. As for the few who had chosen to fight, he said they were already gone, dealt with by him. A heavy steel door opened across the compound, the metal groaning on its hinges. Volkov stepped out into the harsh glare of the floodlights. He was dressed in simple tactical gear, his hands raised high above his head. No weapon was visible. He walked slowly, his pace measured and unafraid, into the very center of the compound. He stopped directly under the brightest light, a lone figure in a circle of white, and looked directly toward where he knew Reese was standing. He reminded her of what he had said before, that mercy must be earned. He told her to consider this his payment. The assault team didn't wait for a second invitation. They swarmed him like a pack of wolves, tackling him to the ground with practiced violence. They pinned him in the dirt, zip-tying his hands behind his back with such force the plastic bit into his skin. Volkov didn't offer even a flicker of resistance. He let them do their job, his body limp and cooperative, but his eyes never once left Reese's face. They were calm, clear, and filled with a peace that seemed entirely out of place in a theater of war. Morris arrived 10 minutes later, stepping off a command chopper as the site was being secured. He surveyed the scene with an expression that flickered between profound relief and utter disbelief. There were 32 detainees, all unharmed, and enough weapons and high-grade explosives to fuel a small-scale insurgency for a year. And in the middle of it all was Volkov, the most wanted sniper in 3 hemispheres, served up on a silver platter. Morris turned to Reese, his face tight. He asked her to explain it. She looked at the man in the zip ties and then back at her commander. She said simply that he had kept his word. Morris scoffed at the notion. He reminded her of Volkov's history, of the hundreds of lives he had extinguished over his long, bloody career. He asked how a man like that could be trusted. Reese looked at the line of detainees being led away, young men who would see another sunrise because of a choice made in the dark. She asked Morris if saving hundreds of lives didn't matter as much as the lives he'd taken. Morris didn't have an answer. He stood there for a moment, the wind whipping his jacket, before shaking his head and walking away toward the communications array. He left Reese standing there in the middle of the compound, the sheer weight of what she had set in motion settling over her like a heavy, cold blanket. As the extraction began, Volkov was led toward a transport vehicle, his movements still graceful despite his bound hands. Before the guards could hoist him inside, he stopped and called out to her. He asked for a moment of her time. Reese walked over, her boots crunching on the gravel. The guards tensed, their fingers tightening on their triggers, but she gave them a sharp nod, waving them back. She stood before him, the man who had been her shadow and her teacher in the dark. "What?" she asked, her voice a low rasp. Volkov smiled. It was the first time she had ever seen a genuine smile on his face, and the transformation was startling. It softened the harsh lines of his features, making him look less like a phantom of the battlefield and almost kind. He told her a story then, one that hadn't been in any of the intelligence briefings. He told her about Chechnya in 1996. He had been pinned down in a crumbling apartment block, bleeding out from a gut wound, certain that his life was over. He said a man had come back for him, risking everything under a hail of Russian lead to drag him to safety. That man was Eli Callahan. Volkov said he had asked Eli why he did it, why he would risk a decorated career and his own life for an enemy. Eli had simply said, "Because I choose to." At the time, Volkov confessed he hadn't understood. He thought Eli was a fool, a man weakened by sentimentality. But now, after decades of blood and loss, he told her he finally understood. He said that choosing mercy when you have the absolute power to kill is the strongest thing a human being can do. He gestured with his chin toward the trucks where the detainees were being loaded. He told her those men would live because she had shown him that specific strength, because she had chosen not to pull the trigger when the world told her she should. He asked her if that had been her father's lesson or her own. Reese stood in the dust of the compound, the wind tugging at her hair. She thought about the range in Georgia, the heavy rifle, and the sad smile of a man who knew he was passing on a burden. She told Volkov she thought it was both. The old sniper nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He said Eli had taught her well, better perhaps than Eli had ever managed to teach him. He leaned back against the hard, plastic seat of the transport. He acknowledged that he would likely spend the remainder of his days in a concrete cell, but he said he would do so knowing he finally understood what Eli had been trying to say all those years ago. To him, that was worth the price. The guards slammed the doors shut, the heavy metal clanging with a finality that echoed through the valley. Reese stood there, a solitary figure in the fading light of the floodlights, watching the taillights of the transport disappear into the vast, devouring darkness of the desert. Haynes appeared beside her a moment later, the familiar scent of tobacco trailing in his wake. He asked if she was okay. She told him she didn't know and that he should ask her again in a few years. Haynes let out a dry chuckle. He finally lit his cigarette, the orange cherry glowing brightly in the dark. He told her that, for what it was worth, he thought she had made the right call, all of them, even letting Volkov go the first time. He pointed out the math: 32 insurgents off the board, a major training hub dismantled, and one less legendary sniper haunting the mountain passes. He took a long, slow drag and told her that her old man would be proud. Reese looked up at the stars. They were the same stars her father used to point out to her when she was a child, before the world became a map of targets and trajectories. Back then, the world had seemed simple, a place where right and wrong were clearly defined. She had spent years trying to run from his shadow, trying to carve out a life that didn't involve his legacy. But she realized now that you don't escape shadows. You don't outrun the past. You simply learn how to carry it without letting it break you. 6 months later, the air was different. Instead of the dry heat of the desert or the biting cold of the mountains, it was the humid, salt-tinged air of Virginia. Reese stood in front of a classroom at Quantico, the walls lined with diagrams of internal ballistics and topographical maps. Before her sat 24 Marine recruits, their faces a mix of youthful bravado, intense curiosity, and thinly veiled skepticism. They were the next generation, the ones who would soon be sent into the dark places of the world. She didn't say a word at first. She simply picked up her Barrett, the rifle that had been her constant companion through the fire, and set it on the heavy oak table at the front of the room. The sound of the bipod hitting the wood was like a gavel. She looked at them, really looked at them, seeing her own younger self reflected in their eyes. The uncertainty, the desire to prove themselves, the dangerous belief that they were invincible. She introduced herself as Gunnery Sergeant Reese Callahan. She told them she was there to teach them how to be snipers. But before they touched a single round of ammunition, she told them they needed to understand one fundamental truth. She repeated the words that had become her mantra. The rifle does not make you powerful. It makes you responsible. Responsible for every shot taken, every shot held, every life saved, and every life ended. A hand went up in the second row. A young recruit, his uniform crisp and his eyes bright with ambition, asked the question that every novice eventually asks. He wanted to know how you know. How do you know when to take the shot and when to hold fire? Reese felt a faint smile touch her lips. It was the same question she had asked her father a lifetime ago on a sun-drenched range in Georgia. Now she finally had the answer. She told him that you don't. Not at first. She told them they would make mistakes. They would stay awake at night second-guessing every decision they made. They would carry the weight of those choices until they felt like their bones might snap under the pressure. She picked up the rifle, the weight of it familiar and grounding in her calloused hands. She told them that over time, they would learn. They would learn that the hardest shot isn't the one at 2,000 meters in a crosswind. The hardest shot, she said, is the one you choose not to take. Because that is the shot that defines who you are as a human being. She could see it in their faces. They didn't fully grasp it yet. To them, it was still an abstract concept, a bit of philosophy from a veteran. But she knew they would understand eventually. They would have to, just as she had. After the class dismissed, the room echoing with the scrape of chairs and the low chatter of students, Reese walked out to the parking lot. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, golden shadows across the asphalt. She found Haynes leaning against the side of his truck, a wide, easy grin on his face. He asked how the new batch was holding up. She gave him the same answer she had given him in the desert. Ask her in a few years. Haynes laughed, the sound warm and genuine. He remarked that some things never change. He opened the passenger door and offered to buy her a beer. He wanted to hear all about how she was turning these kids into the next generation of American heroes. Reese climbed into the truck, the leather seat warm from the sun. She told him she wasn't trying to make them heroes. She was just trying to teach them how to stay alive. Haynes started the engine and asked if it wasn't the same thing. Reese stared out the window as they pulled out of the lot. Her mind drifted. She thought about Volkov sitting in a cell, finally at peace with a lesson decades in the making. She thought about her father's voice on the porch, a quiet, steady presence in her memory. She thought about Briggs, her spotter, standing on that rooftop in the heat, trusting her with his life. She told Haynes it wasn't the same thing at all. Heroes, she said, die for what they believe in. She was teaching these recruits to live for it. There was a profound difference between the two. Haynes nodded, his expression turning thoughtful as he navigated the evening traffic. He conceded that she was probably right. As they drove away from the sprawling grounds of Quantico, Reese pulled out her phone. She scrolled to a message she had received earlier that morning. It was from Morris, typically brief and stripped of emotion. He informed her that the intel provided by Volkov had led to the neutralization of 3 more major training facilities and the capture of nearly 50 high-level insurgent fighters. Most importantly, he noted that the operations had been carried out with 0 American casualties. Reese stared at the words for a long time, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes. Then, she hit delete. She watched the green trees of Virginia blur past the window. Somewhere in a corner of the world she might never visit again, soldiers were packing their gear to go home to their families. They were going home because of the choices she had made in the silence of a sniper hide. They were going home because she had finally learned what her father had spent his entire life trying to show her. She understood now that true strength wasn't measured in the number of kills confirmed or the rows of ribbons pinned to a dress uniform. It was measured in the lives you chose to preserve when you had every justification to end them. Her father had carried that weight until the day he died, and it had been a heavy burden. But he had also passed down something far more valuable than marksmanship or tactical brilliance. He had passed down the understanding that mercy wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the most difficult, most exhausting form of courage there was. Now, it was her turn. It was her turn to carry that lesson forward, to instill it into the minds of the young men and women who would follow in her footsteps. She wanted them to understand what Volkov had finally realized in a dusty valley in Afghanistan. She wanted them to know, before they ever placed a finger on a trigger, that the most important shot they would ever take was the one they chose to hold back. Because that choice was the only thing that proved you were more than just a sophisticated weapon system. It was the only thing that proved you were still human in a world that tried to strip that humanity away every single day. Choosing to hold onto that spark of empathy was the bravest thing a soldier could do. Reese Callahan had started her journey as an ammo carrier, a girl trying to hide in the long, intimidating shadow of her father's legacy. She had become a sniper who understood that a legacy wasn't about duplicating someone else's achievements or living up to a ghost's expectations. It was about taking the hard-won lessons, paid for in blood and sacrifice, and using them to protect those who came after. She wasn't her father. She would never be Eli Callahan, and she had finally realized she didn't need to be. She had learned the only lesson that truly mattered, the one that separated the survivors from the casualties, the soldiers from the killers, and the warriors from the mere weapons. She knew now that the trigger wasn't where the power was kept. The power lived in the heart and the mind, in the split-second decision to show grace when the world demanded violence. That was the lesson worth teaching. That was the legacy worth carrying into the future. And that was the ultimate difference between being a good shot and being someone who could truly save lives with a rifle. As the truck merged onto the highway, disappearing into the flow of the evening, Reese Callahan felt the weight on her shoulders. It was heavy, yes, but for the first time in her life, it felt exactly right.